Potassium is a mineral found in our intracellular fluid. In contrast to what we reviewed about sodium, the intake of potassium in the US falls well below the recommended AI level of 4,700 milligrams per day. Interestingly, potassium is found in high concentrations in non-processed foods, such as whole fruits, vegetables, and legumes, with some of the highest levels in bananas, potatoes, avocados, and coconut water. Together, the high intake of sodium paired with the low intake of potassium are thought to in part account for the high occurrence of hypertension in the US. While the sodium video also reviewed potassium's role in electrolyte and fluid balance, this video will review the key characteristics and additional roles of potassium in the body, such as its role in pH balance. Additionally, we will review deficiency and toxicity symptoms of this nutrient. So we'll first review food sources of potassium. So largely foods containing high amounts of potassium will be unprocessed foods such as fruit and vegetables. So we see the fruits and vegetables high in potassium. Also, legumes, nuts, and seeds will be high in potassium. We can see here that the average daily intake of potassium in the United States in men is approximately 2,800 to 3,300 milligrams per day. In women, it's 2,200 to 2,400 milligrams per day. And this is actually an inadequate or low intake compared to the adequate intake level of 4,700 milligrams per day. And this lower intake is attributed to a low intake of whole fruits and vegetables and also beans and legumes. And you can see when compared to the presentation on sodium that we saw that the intake of sodium was very high as compared to the adequate intake level. We see the opposite with potassium, where the intake is very low compared to the adequate intake level, and this is attributed largely to a higher intake of processed and manufactured foods, higher in sodium, and a lower intake of whole fruits and vegetables, grains, beans, and legumes. So we'll discuss the absorption and transport of potassium, so we can see that it's absorbed along the different levels of the small intestine and colon. The percent absorbed is very high, relatively high. We can see that's similar to sodium. We also saw a high percent absorption for sodium. We see that we have potassium and hydrogen ATPase pumps that are exchanging intracellular hydrogen for luminal potassium. We see that once in the enterocyte, potassium enters the blood via diffusion, and we see uptake by non-intestinal cells via active transport. So we have an intracellular potassium concentration that's going to be higher inside versus outside the cell, and we discussed this when we had our slides on sodium. So we have more potassium inside versus outside the cell, and this is established by the sodium potassium ATPase pumps, which brings potassium from outside the cell to inside the cell. It does the opposite to sodium. It takes sodium from inside the cell and pumps it outside of the cell. So we'll see the involvement of potassium in these key functions and mechanisms, so specifically with the contractility of muscle and the excitability of nerve tissue. This is very similar to the functions and mechanisms that we saw for sodium. A unique role for potassium that we're going to see is in its role in maintaining pH balance. So it does this with other ions as well. We'll see its role here in more detail. So we see that the end product of oxidation of energy nutrients is carbon dioxide. So one of the end products is carbon dioxide, which is formed with the processes of energy metabolism, such as the Krebs cycle, also the pyruvate dehydrogenase complex, we saw formation of the CO2. So with formation of the CO2, we see that it immediately combines with water to form carbonic acid. So we see it form this H2CO3, which is carbonic acid. This carbonic acid quickly ionizes to an hydrogen ion and bicarbonate. So this is all part of a byproduct of metabolism, this hydrogen ion. And this is after we have the joining of the CO2 with water to form the carbonic acid, which then is ionized to the hydrogen ion and bicarbonate. So from there, bicarbonate may combine with cations, sodium and potassium, or proteins such as hemoglobin, which then emphasizes and describes potassium's role in the maintenance of pH balance. So we'll now review the excretion of potassium. So we see that potassium is largely excreted in the urine, some in the feces, but mostly in the urine. Balance is regulated by the kidney and with aldosterone. So we saw the regulation of potassium levels in the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. When the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system was active, we saw an increase in aldosterone, with aldosterone increasing the retention of sodium and the excretion of potassium. So with the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, we have potassium excretion. We also see different medications such as thiazide and diuretics also increasing potassium loss. We can see here deficiency symptoms of potassium. So with hypokalemia, low serum potassium, we have and can see severe fluid loss associated with that, diarrhea and vomiting. And with more severe cases, we can see hypokalemia leading to cardiac arrhythmias, muscle weakness, and also glucose intolerance. So we see with hypokalemia, we have reduced insulin secretion, so it also having an effect on the secretion of insulin and then affecting glucose tolerance. We can see potassium toxicity called hyperkalemia. This is high serum potassium. So we can see that high serum potassium can also lead to cardiac arrhythmias and in severe cases lead to cardiac arrest. So this can be very dangerous if we have potassium levels that are too high. We can see the adequate intake level. Again, the AI level for potassium is 4,700 milligrams per day. So to get adequate potassium, it's recommended to consume plenty of fruits and vegetables, also whole grains, beans, and legumes. And we have no tolerable upper intake level for potassium if we're consuming potassium from food sources. So this is in comparison to supplements or medications with containing potassium, but from food sources, there is no tolerable upper intake level for potassium.